Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. And we'll get started. So I am so grateful that all of you are here today. Just so you know kind of what today is going to look like, I'm going to do a brief introduction, then do an overview of what youth registration is, what those laws look like, talk about some, oh, I actually changed where that is. So I'm not going to talk about registration adjacent policies right there, but I will at some point. Talk a little bit about the policy justifications, kind of the reasons behind the creation of youth registration, and then talk about the effects of youth registration on young people and on society. And hopefully leave everyone with some food for thought, and we'll also have times for questions and answers. If you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat, and if they're particularly relevant, the folks from Haruv will stop me and ask the question, and I'm happy to answer them as we go along, but I'll also try to preserve some time at the end so we can answer any final questions. So, before we get started, I want to make it clear, I'm an attorney. I am not a clinician. And so as I address this, I'm addressing it primarily from a legal standpoint and from a policy standpoint. I will be talking about mental health and things like that and some of the research that's come, but I am in no way an expert on that or on the treatment of young people who cause sexual harm. There are some incredible experts, and some of them will be sending out these slides afterwards, and there's a bunch of citations that will come with them. And so if you want to follow up on some of the research or follow up with those researchers, their information will be in the handout. We are talking about sexual violence, and we're talking about sexual violence committed by young people. And young people tend to commit sexual harm to other young people, so we are also talking about child sexual violence. I encourage everyone who's here today to take care of yourselves. This is being recorded. It'll be put online later. So if you're not here for it right now and you want to come back and visit it, you certainly can. We'll also be talking a bit about suicide, incarceration, and the harms of the juvenile and criminal legal systems. So that's just kind of a content warning going forward. Before we get started on actually talking about youth registration, I want to kind of do a brief, I guess I'll say, a reflection. So either on your own, like write it down on a piece of paper, think about it for a moment, or if you're really inspired to, put it in the chat. What comes to your mind when you hear that someone is a sex offender? So what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What do you think about them? What are your assumptions? What are your beliefs? Take a moment, think about that, write it down, put it in the chat. All right, and now I'm going to ask, what feelings come up for you when you hear the term sex offender? So what are your kind of emotional reactions to that term, or again, to folks who are labeled as sex offenders? Again, in the chat, on your own. All right, so I've realized that I don't know if people are putting things in the chat because I can't see it if they are.
I'll read some of them. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so to your first question, a few of the responses were they must have experienced some kind of violence themselves, unsafe around children, predatory, not someone you want to be friends with or live next door, not trustworthy, challenging work ahead, what was their history? And then for personal feelings, sad, worried, fear, anger, frightening, protectiveness, unsafe, ostracized, barriers, trauma, uncomfortable, sad for them because they're so young with this life-altering label, anger and sadness for the victim.
Thank you, Dijon. And thank you all. I think, I definitely heard in that kind of a mix of feelings, both the sadness and the acknowledgement of some of the trauma that might lead a young person to then cause sexual harm, as well as some of the kind of harder, I don't know if harder isn't quite the right emotion or the right word, but emotions like anger, fear, the idea of predatoriness, things like that. And so I really want to start this kind of grounded in an acknowledgement that conversations about sexual violence, especially sexual violence against children, often evoke strong emotions, including many of the ones that you all named. And our public conversations about people who commit sexual violence are often a reflection of our long history of minimizing, denial, and victim blaming, including for childhood sexual violence. And it's important to acknowledge this history and also acknowledge the history of coddling certain individuals who have perpetrated sexual harm. This work, the work that I do on youth registration, exists in that world. And all of the work that we do responding to sexual harm exists in those realities. As I go through this presentation and we do talk about individuals who cause sexual harm, I ask that you notice when emotions come up for you. Notice them, don't judge them. Usually judging those things isn't the most helpful, but notice when they're coming up and kind of how they affect what you are learning and what we're talking about. I also want to say before we really get started on the information here, that this presentation is not intended to minimize the harms of sexual violence or blame victims for any of the harms experienced by individuals who cause sexual violence as a result of disclosure. Encouraging disclosure is incredibly important, and caring for people who've experienced sexual harm is also incredibly important. So this, again, that's I think that we can both live in a world where the harms exist and also where we can do a better job responding in certain ways. So let's talk about registration generally. There are kind of three parts of registration. The first is registration itself. Generally, registration requires individuals, including youth, to go to the sheriff's office, a police department, or sometimes a specific department for registration and disclose certain personal information, which can include a variety of things such as fingerprints, photos, identifying marks, home address, phone numbers, social media identifiers, email addresses, vehicles that they own, things like that. It also often includes regular check-ins. So individuals who are registered often have to go on an annual basis. Oftentimes, if someone is unhoused or homeless, they might have to go weekly or every month to check in person. And then it can also often include address verification, where law enforcement is responsible for going out and confirming that an individual lives at the address that they have provided as their address. The second part of registration schemes is notification. Notification is basically when information about individuals who are registered is made public. In some states, it's put on public websites, and kind of whose information is included on those websites and what information is included on those websites varies differently across the country. But it's often put on websites. It often includes addresses, again, names, aliases, place of employment, things like that. There's also notification schemes where maybe people's information isn't on the internet, or it is, and then the police or other law enforcement are responsible for disclosing information about certain registered individuals to schools, employers, social media websites, things like that. And then the final part of notification can sometimes include kind of proactive measures that the registered individual might take. And in some states, that might be the person has to print out postcards that have their photo and say what their offense was and send those to all their neighbors, often at their own expense, or maybe put a sign in their yard on Halloween that says, no trick-or-treating, a sex offender lives here, something like that. Finally, you have failure to register, which is the penalty when individuals do not comply with their registration requirements or notification requirements, depending on what those are. So typically, and this varies a bit by state, again, that's a hard thing talking about all these laws at once, but typically any failure to comply with registration or notification can result in a conviction of failure to register, regardless of whether the person knew that they had to report a particular change, like that they went from full-time student to part-time student or things like that. And depending on the state, it can be either a misdemeanor or a felony. The penalties for failure to register range anywhere from something like 30 days in jail to 30 years in prison. So again, it really depends on the state.
Vic, we do have one question about DNA registration, if that's like a norm for most states.
So some states do collect DNA identifiers with registration. It really, again, that's going to depend on the state. That information, I've been doing a lot of research on Florida recently. So for example, Florida, if the individual has had their DNA collected, that might be part of the registration process, is law enforcement collecting the DNA markers so that person can be identified later potentially, but not always. So a really important piece of registration, and this is like a grossly oversimplified way to explain what happens in the juvenile justice system. So you have a young person who's committed an act of harm. They might receive a charge, get adjudicated delinquent, and then receive a sentence. And that sentence could be probation, it could be some other form of supervision, it could be detention, it could be treatment, things like that. Registration is a completely separate regulatory scheme. So it's not part of the punishment, it's not part of the sentence, it is a kind of a purportedly public safety measure that's taken usually after the sentence is complete, or if the person is released and on probation or something, may be taken immediately. So again, not part of the punishment, not part of the kind of initial way of addressing the harm. It's a separate scheme. So just a little bit about the history of kind of how we got where we are. There are 3 federal laws that have really shaped what state law looks like in terms of sex offender registries. The first one was the Jacob Wetterling Act in 1994. This followed the murder of Jacob Wetterling, who was a young white child who was murdered by a stranger. And this act just created a private registry of adults who had committed or been convicted for sex offenses. And it required states to do the same, to create registries of adults. In 1996, Megan's Law was enacted following the murder of Megan Kenka, who was, again, a young white child who was murdered by a neighbor who was a stranger, but who had committed a sex offense and was a registered individual. And Megan's family felt that if they had known that this individual was living near them, they could have taken better precautions. And so Megan's Law is the law that first created the requirements that states create a way to notify communities about registered individuals living in them. And finally, we get to the Adam Walsh Act in 2006. It's called the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, or SORNA. So if I say SORNA, this is the law that I'm referring to. And this act did a couple of things. It creates a crime-based tiering system, which means depending on the offense that an individual commits, there'll be either a tier 1, which is the lowest tier, and those are typically like non-contact offenses, things like that, up to a tier 3, which is going to be the more violent offenses and forcible offenses. And the length of registration, information required, potential penalties if someone fails to register, all vary depending on what tier someone is put in. The Adam Walsh Act was also the first act to require states to register children. And it requires states to register youth who are 14 or older and who commit certain offenses, including offenses particularly against children. And then the last thing it did is it applied registration retroactively, which means even if you were convicted 40 years ago and you had never had to register for, or you were adjudicated delinquent 40 years ago and you had never had to register, with the passage of this act, if your offense would require you to register now, you're going to have to start registering, even if in those 40 years you have not committed another offense. So there are a wide array of registerable offenses. As I mentioned, the federal laws were passed after the particularly notorious murders of young white children by strangers. And so those types of offenses are certainly caught up in the laws and are one of the focuses of registration and notification laws. So you do have the forcible offenses, rape, sexual assault, kidnapping, things like that. And then you also have non-forcible offenses, which might be registerable. So for young people, that's often statutory offenses, which will be things like statutory rape, which is only a violation of the law based on the ages of the young person, though the sexual activity may be voluntary, and also things like molestation. And these laws have also come to cover non-contact offenses like public indecency or sexting. So if two young people send each other nude photos, they both might be charged with a sexual offense that becomes registerable for something like possession and distribution of child pornography. We've also seen young people end up on registries because of public urination, streaking, things like that. So again, it's this very kind of broad array of offenses that are some of them very different from the offenses that registration was initially created to address. The Adam Walsh Act requires states to register all youth 14 and older who are adjudicated for certain offenses. And almost every state in this country has passed a law to register young people. So currently there are 39 states that have laws on the books that allow youth registration. Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that the youth registration scheme there was unconstitutional a number of years ago. And so they actually do not register young people who are adjudicated delinquent. While almost every state registers young people for juvenile adjudications, every single state registers young people who are convicted in adult court, who commit offenses as youth and then are transferred and tried in adult court. Of the states that do register young people, 4 states require lifetime registration for all youth who are adjudicated delinquent, and 19 allow for lifetime registration. There are 9 states that have no mechanism to remove youth from the registry, and 5 of those states do registration for life. So if a young person is adjudicated delinquent at 14 and they have no way of getting off and it's lifetime, that means that they will spend the rest of their life on the registry. And only 5 states, and it's about to be 6 because California has a law that's going into effect in 2022, do not subject any registered youth to any form of community notification, which means that of the 38 states that register youth, 33 of them in some way make youth information public. And that looks really different depending on the state. So for example, Florida, they put all the youth who are registered on their public website, and you can look them up and find their home addresses and things like that. And in somewhere like Louisiana, it's not super public. Generally, that information is private, but if a young person works at a sports facility and they're registered, they have to put a notice on the door. So again, it varies what that looks like. So while the federal law only requires that states register young people 14 and older for certain offenses, we've seen kind of a large array of youth who are caught up in these laws. States have registered children as young as 8 years old. I've actually heard of a 6-year-old being registered, but I've never been able to verify that. And again, some of those states do registration for life with no option to get off. Many survivors of childhood sexual abuse end up on the registry. Youth who are trafficking victims, so if they engaged in acts that constitute sex offenses and are adjudicated delinquent, they might end up on registries. Youth in foster care disproportionately might end up on registries because they're supervised much more, and so sexual activities that other young folks might engage in and not be detected or not, be reported to the police, must be reported if they're in a facility or something like that. LGBTQ youth are more likely to be adjudicated delinquent for sexual offenses than heterosexual youth are. And so through that, they're more likely to end up on registries. And we also see massive racial disparities for Black and Brown youth that are also present in other places in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. Just as an example, in California in 2018, 76% of registered youth were youth of color, and Black youth were 6.5 times more likely than white youth to be registered for the exact same offense. So, there are a number of policy justifications that were put forward when registration schemes were proposed. And I'm kind of going to draw out 4 of the kind of biggest ones. The first one is what I call uniqueness, which is this idea that there is a subset of individuals who are sexual offenders that are kind of, it's a type of person, it's a person that you can identify. The second one is that individuals who commit sexual offenses have very high recidivism rates and therefore need to be tracked at all times or kept in detention. The third one is the idea of incorrigibility. So the idea that individuals who commit sexual offenses cannot change. And then the final one is public safety. So that registries help police investigate sexual crimes and decrease the likelihood that individuals will commit first-time sex offenses or will commit later sex offense after conviction. These were all policy justifications that were put forward for the adults, for an adult population. And all of them were just kind of put on young people. So there was this assumption that young people were basically young adult sex offenders. And these policies were kind of just directly applied to youth. And before we move on, because I think it's important to kind of acknowledge these policy justifications and talk about them, I believe we have a poll. Dijon, can you put the poll up?
Avital's gonna do the poll for
Avital.
us. She's got it going.
So this just asks, which policy justification for registration do you find most persuasive? Like, which one do you think this makes the most sense for a reason to register young people? Right, we'll take about 10 more seconds or go from there. All right, so I don't know if we can show, or if we're sharing the poll results, great. So we as a group find this public safety justification. So the idea that registration decreases the likelihood that individuals will create sex offenses in the first place, decreases the likelihood of recidivism, and also helps police investigate sexually based offenses. We find that as a group kind of most persuasive, and folks also find the idea of recidivism, that there's a very high rate of recidivism, persuasive. So thank you all for doing that. Hopefully we'll revisit these results as we continue going. So let's talk about each of these justifications. The first one is uniqueness. And again, these policies were kind of created to respond to adults who committed offenses against children who were strangers. And then were just simply applied to young people. So here's what we know about young people who cause sexual harm. Harmful adolescent sexual activity and behavior is often the result of impulsivity and curiosity. The curiosity is especially true for younger children who might be experimenting, not knowing that they're causing harm. And impulsivity is kind of one of the hallmarks of adolescence. And in that way, adolescent sexual behavior and adolescents who cause sexual harm, that behavior is similar to other adolescent criminal behavior. We also know that youth who are adjudicated delinquents for sexual offenses are more likely to commit non-sexual offenses in the future than they are to commit sexual offenses. And lastly, we know that there's not a single risk assessment right now for young people that accurately predicts recidivism. I saw a study recently where they created a risk assessment for young people in this high-risk treatment group. And though they were able to capture that the risk assessment predicted all of the youth who did go on to sexually offend in the future, it over-predicted which youth would do so by 90%. So 9 out of 10 youth who were viewed as high risk did not end up committing another sexual offense in the future, and only 10% did. So it's a really hard thing to predict, and oftentimes it's going to over-predict which youth are high risk. And I've seen studies that also have found that Black and brown youth, particularly youth of color, are more likely to be assessed as high risk, despite no evidence that they're more likely to be high risk. The second justification is the high rate of recidivism. And what we know is that young people who commit sexual offenses have a very low recidivism rate. The rates are anywhere from 1% to 7% and declining. Many of the more recent studies have found rates between 1% and 3%. And again, young people are much more likely to commit non-sex offenses than they are to commit a later sex offense. We also know that failure to register offenses don't predict recidivism, so that kind of penalty to hopefully capture people who would be more likely to commit sexual offenses and who might be failing to register in order to do so, that's not a predictor of which young people will go on to commit sexual offenses. We also know that youth sex offending does not predict adult sexual offending. So part of the idea of incorrigibility and part of the reason that registration was kind of put on young people and applied to young people was a couple of studies talking to adults who had been convicted of sexual offenses who stated that they had begun their sexual offending when they were young. And so that idea was, oh, okay, if we can capture young people and start monitoring young people when they're young, when they commit that first sexual offense, we're hopefully going to be predicting these or preventing these later sexual offenses. But we've simply found or researchers have found, I have not, that youth sexual offending does not predict adult sexual offending. We also know that the type of offense does not predict recidivism. So oftentimes people will say, okay, I can understand why something like sexting or certain statutory offenses, things like that maybe shouldn't be registered, but the forcible offenses, forcible rape, things like that, clearly that person is going to be a danger in the future, a higher risk of being a danger in the future. But the type of offense also doesn't predict which young people will go on to commit later sexual offenses. And we also know, and we as a group did not find incorrigibility the most convincing of policy reasons, I think probably because many of the folks here work with young people and know that young people do change and that they mature and grow and all of those wonderful things about working with young people. We know that clinical interventions are an effective tool to address sexually abusive behaviors in young people. Finally, we get to public safety, which is the reason that we all found most convincing. And so part of the public safety idea is the idea that it's going to help police investigate sexually based offenses. And one problem with that is that we know that the vast majority of sexual violence is caused by someone known to the victim. So who committed a particular sexual offense is not going to be at issue in most sexual violence cases. This is particularly true for adolescents who commit acts of sexual violence. Only around 2.5% of adolescents offend against a stranger. So it's that's a pretty rare event. We also know that 90+% of individuals who are convicted of sexual offenses, so this is looking at adult courts, I have not found similar numbers for juvenile courts. About 90% of them do not have a criminal record for sexual violence, which means that they would not be on a registry in the first place. So this kind of goes to the piece of helping police investigate individuals, and also the idea that it discourages, that registration discourages first-time offenses or discourages recidivism. It's simply the vast majority, again, these laws were created based on the rarest forms of childhood sexual violence, which is that committed by adults who are strangers. And they've been used to apply to kind of this broad range of sexual violence, much of which is very different from the types of offenses these laws were created to address, especially when it comes to young people. So the other thing that we know is young people who do commit another act of sexual violence are most likely to do so while still under court supervision. So young people who do reoffend are likely to do so shortly after initially being caught and adjudicated for the sexual offense that was detected, which means that there's already kind of structures in place that would hopefully identify that this was happening and would have a response and help with investigation and all of those types of things. As I said a moment ago, registration doesn't significantly impact either first-time sexual offenses or recidivism. And we also know that registration actually leads to fewer sexual offense adjudications. There's been a couple of studies looking at what happened when states passed youth registration schemes and found that as prosecutors and defense attorneys are trying to avoid registration for young people, they're going to work on pleading that young person down for a different type of offense, like an assault offense instead of a sexually based offense, to avoid that registration piece because there's so much data on the harms, which we're about to start talking about. And that sometimes means that the young person cannot get access to kind of the specific resources that are for young people who do commit sexual offenses. So in some ways, it's actually diverting young people away from needed resources, and also might be deflating what we know, like the information on sexual offenses that are happening and are committed by young people. So let's keep talking about public safety. Just in terms of like the practical piece of registration, young people who have to register are often going to the exact same locations as adults who have to register. So they're going into the sheriff's office and going to the window that says sexual offender registration or sex offender registration and providing all that same information. There's a couple of pieces of that there's the external piece, which is who else is going to likely be there. And then there's also the piece of a young person having to walk into a building that says like sex offenders register here and the impact that can have on young people. In a couple of states that do post young people's information on the internet, that means that often their home address is on the internet. And because young people are more likely to offend against a family member, that often means that if the family has been reunified with supports, that the state may also be placing the victim's address on the internet and making that public, or the school or their employer, things like that. Youth registration also leads to greater, a much higher likelihood that a young person will themselves experience sexual violence. So in a study looking at young people who were adjudicated delinquent for a sex offense and then registered versus young people who were adjudicated for the same sex offenses and not put on a registry, one study found that registered youth are 2 times more likely to report experiencing a forcible sexual assault in the previous year than the non-registered youth. It also found that registered youth were 5 times more likely to be approached by an adult for sex than the non-registered youth. Finally, about 44% of registered youth report experiencing homelessness at some point, which also increases the likelihood that they'll experience violence, including sexual violence. So in some ways, the exact harms that youth registration or that registration was designed to prevent, which is sexual violence against children, is actually being caused or increasing the likelihood that it will happen because of youth registration. It also has some pretty harmful effects on youth development. So there's the labeling effect, which is how it alters how a young person thinks about themselves, if they think about themselves as a sex offender. And all of those things that we kind of identified early in this presentation come with that label, the assumptions, the emotions, all of that. It also alters societal views of that young person's personality traits. So there are some states that will say, you know, the date of adjudication for a young person. But many of them will simply say, like, this is a registered sex offender and they offended against a minor. And that individual might now be 40 and it looks like they're an adult who offended against a child when in fact they were also a child. And young people are more likely to offend within their age group. And you see as young people age, so as they go from preteen up through the older teenager, they tend to continue offending within their same age group. But that information, once they're an adult and that information is still public, that isn't going to be clear oftentimes from registration. And finally, it identifies youth as the one thing that we don't want them to be. We don't want young people to go on and commit further acts of sexual violence. But what we often say is, once you're a sex offender, you're a sex offender, period. And you can't ever change that. You certainly, well, I think we can probably all agree, you can't undo that. That is harm that cannot be undone. But it locks young people into being kind of what is often societally viewed as the worst of the worst. It also has pretty measurable impacts on young people's mental health. So just kind of general mental health measures like anxiety, depression, hyperactivity. In the same study that compared registered youth to non-registered youth, they found that registered children were 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-registered children. And about 7% of registered youth report attempting suicide. So it has, again, major effects on mental health. So I said at the beginning that I had moved where I talked about adjacent policies. In addition to the mental health effects and the safety effects of registration, there are a whole host of other policies that also often come with registration. So residency restrictions, which can include anything from kind of bubbles around schools and parks that say registered individuals cannot live within 2,500 feet of a school or a park, and also laws that prevent registered individuals from living in things like public housing. And so if a young person is adjudicated delinquent and put on a registry, their family might lose their housing if the young person is going home, or the family might be put in the position of choosing whether or not they're going to be able to bring their child home in order to maintain their housing. There are tremendous employment barriers. There's some states that have passed laws specifically preventing registered individuals from engaging in certain businesses or obtaining certain licenses. But also just the label of sexual offender, the publicness of that information means that that employment is incredibly difficult to obtain. There are travel restrictions. There's some states that kind of no matter how short of a time you're going to be in them, if you're just driving through the corner to get to another state, you, because you entered that state, have to drive out of your way to register and then can continue on your way. Individuals have to report international travel 21 days before they go on it, even if they might not know that they were going to need to take a trip if a family member dies or something like that. And also some states, Florida is notorious for this. If a young person travels to Florida, let's say on a spring break trip, as many young people do, and they have to register because they're there for more than 3 days, they will then be on Florida's registry for the rest of their life, even if they are removed from their home state registry, or even after they die. There's a lot of people on Florida's registry who are deceased and are still on the registry. There are educational barriers that might come from kind of the typical involvement in the juvenile justice system, but also a young person who might not be allowed to be around other young people, or might not be able to attend a campus that's in person, so they might have to attend a school online. And then there's civil commitment, which is the practice that allows some states to indefinitely detain individuals who are adjudicated or convicted of certain sexual offenses. And some states do include young people in their civil commitment, usually committing them when they turn 18 or are released from juvenile justice custody. There's also the cost. So again, just kind of a stark example, in California in 2018, there was $46,000 allocated for victim services, no money allocated for prevention of sexual violence by young people. And the state spent $140 million registering children. So that's, again, like verifying addresses, just all the infrastructure that's needed to register young people, the hearings that happen. It has this incredible cost for very little, if any, public safety benefit. So take a moment, take a deep breath, and then either on your own or in the chat, just take one moment and write down, like, what's the takeaway that you have from today's presentation? And I will provide my takeaway in a minute.
Vic, while people are writing in their takeaway, can I ask a question that had come up while you were presenting?
Please do.
Okay, so Katrina Goodjoy asked if judges in the states where there aren't mandatory registrations, if they have any discretion on the length of time that youth are registered, and then the racial disparities that you talked about, does that lay in like courts and judges, or is that even like come to like when the incident happens, does it get reported? Does it get, you know, moved through the system at a higher rate?
So I unfortunately don't have a lot of information. I'll answer the disparities question first.
Okay.
Again, all through the juvenile justice system, we see pretty massive racial disparities in which youth are adjudicated, which end up in detention, which are tried as adults. And Black youth particularly, and Indigenous youth are much more likely to be disproportionately represented as punishments become more harsh. And so, again, I don't have any specific data on it, but I would guess that those disparities are present throughout. In terms of discretion, it really depends on the state in terms of what a judge can do with registration. So in Texas, for example, judges can order registration for certain lengths of time, and they also have the option to order that a young person's information is not made public. So they can be on a private registry as opposed to a public registry. Information on private registries often gets out and ends up being pretty public anyway. But again, it depends on the state. In Oklahoma, I know most people are here from Oklahoma, for example. Young people in Oklahoma are very, very rarely registered, partially because we have a couple of professionals in the state who have worked really hard to make sure that the science that we know, what we know about young people who cause sexual harm, is in part of that system. And is, if a young person is going to be put on the registry, there has to be a specific finding that they pose a significant threat to children under 16 or the public at large. And if they are put on a registry, they're put on until the age of 21 or when they leave OJJ custody. And at that point that they turn 21 or they leave custody, the state can seek to have them put on the adult registry, and a court can choose to extend registration that way. But it really, again, depends on the state.
Okay. Thank you, Vic. I'm going to read a couple of the responses now.
Perfect. Thank you.
So Harmony shared, we are misguided in using shame and labeling as a tool for impacting change. We can do better. Jimmy shared, the more we know from good research outcomes, the better informed we are going to be when advocating for and working with youth. Molly shared, youth with PSB. Molly shared, this is an issue that wasn't on my radar, but I understand now is so clearly important to end cycles of trauma and violence. I am all in for advocating to change this approach. Shelton shared, I feel like we have failed children in regards to assessing and helping children in these scenarios. Someone that I'm not sure what their name is, but it shows as Lappleyard. Another example, juvenile justice government using non-evidence-based practices and failure to provide proactive trauma-informed services. Christy shared, there's so much misinformation that is believed to be true in regard to child versus adult who have offended. And there's another like 20 responses after that. So
thank you all.
mhm.
And thank you, Dijon, for reading those out. When I started,
Dijon, you must read another one that says, another takeaway is that I want Vic to teach me everything. And lots of people agreed with that takeaway.
well, thank you all.
Yeah, we all share that sentiment, I think. Thanks, Avital. I hadn't seen that comment.
So as Dijon said in my introduction, I come out of working with survivors of sexual violence. I did that for 5 years as a volunteer, and then professionally, I actually worked for Divis, which I know a couple of folks are here from, for a year. And I worked with youth for many years. And when I started learning about youth registration, I had a tension, which was we need to do better when we respond to sexual violence. The system of justice that we have, which is the criminal legal system, is pretty horrific when it comes to responding to interpersonal violence, especially sexual violence and domestic violence. And like how, it's hard to work saying we need to do, like we have a system that people often view as a system of accountability. Again, it's not part of the punishment. So this really isn't about that accountability piece. It's about this supposed public safety piece. And how do I engage in this work with my background and with my beliefs about supporting survivors, and what does that really look like? And so my takeaway is that we have to advance policies to end childhood sexual abuse. It has massive devastating effects on individuals who experience it, including the individuals who go on to commit later acts of sexual harm. And as we create those policies, we have to make sure that they're effective and that they don't lead to the harms that we are intending to prevent. So the fact that youth registration leads to more young people experiencing sexual violence, to me, is one of the most disturbing parts of this policy, and the fact that it's not actually improving public safety in any measurable way. All of the studies that have looked at this have not found significant public safety gains. That for me was, that's my reason. So that's my takeaway. We do have a moment now, I think a couple more minutes for questions. So I'm more than happy to take some questions. If you would like to follow up with me, if you have questions, if you're in a state and you're like, we want to do work in this state on registering young people, I saw my state highlighted on that list and I don't want it to be there, or I want to think about how we do that, or do more public education, please reach out to me. It's my full-time job to work on this issue right now, and it's a gift to be able to do so. And I'm more than happy to continue the conversations with folks. I'm going to leave this up, and I'll just let you know there's another slide that has all of my sources. It has like 8-point font because there's a lot of sources, but the folks who have attended will get that information after the presentation.
Okay, great. If you all have questions for Vic, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or type into the chat. Okay, first question. What is the most effective first step to work on our state? From Shelton.
So it depends on what you mean by asking that. If it's in terms of looking at ending youth registration or addressing how youth registration is done in your state, a really good first step is to reach out to me, because each state is different and the ways that the law is applied is going to be different by state. And so I'm always happy to talk with folks who have questions. It might just be starting these conversations. In a lot of the states that are working on this, domestic and sexual violence organizations are leading some of that charge. There's legislators, juvenile judges, a lot of people who work in the juvenile legal system know about the harms of youth registration and are kind of doing quiet things, but receive tremendous pushback from the public because of, again, our perceptions of and our understandings of sexual harm and young people who commit sexual harm. And so, there's probably people who are working on this. The Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, ATSA, does a lot of work around this, and they have a couple of policy papers on it. They're a great resource to start with, lots of ways.
I also missed, I think Lucy Briggs was just kind of dreaming out loud, but was curious about how tribes might be able to participate in this data to understand how this is impacting tribal nations.
That is such a good question. There are a lot of tribes, because they're under the, they might be, many tribes have implemented the federal law kind of as written and are in compliance with federal law. And I've had conversations with a few people kind of on the side about how this is likely affecting tribes, but haven't seen a lot of information. It's a conversation I would love to continue having, and I know there are others who are also interested in.
I think Lucy said that she sent a message to you, Vic, or is going to email you, maybe. Are there other questions? We still have a few minutes if you want to.
I'm gonna give a little piece. Again, I know a lot of folks here are from Oklahoma. Because Oklahoma does not really use youth registration, we have a law that allows it, but it isn't happening right now, partially because you need 2 professionals who are specialists in treating young people who cause sexual harm to testify that that young person poses a serious ongoing risk to children under 16 or the public at large. Young people very rarely end up on the registry here. That's wonderful. However, there are other states that have experts who won't really follow the science, or are, again, just kind of applying the adult world, which isn't also completely what we think it is, to young people. And so, well, Oklahoma is doing really well right now. Last time I talked to someone at OJA, not a single young person who was adjudicated delinquent in Oklahoma was on the registry. There were a couple of youth on the registry who came in from other states, and because they were registered in their home states, they're now registered in Oklahoma. So in some ways that's really great, but if we have an administration change, if we have a change in which treatment providers are doing the testimony, that could change dramatically in Oklahoma. But we're kind of a good test case on why this policy is often unnecessary, and also on the effectiveness of treatment, because we have some pretty incredible treatment programs here that are like community-based, family-based, all of those things.